Chapter 9. The Ascent of Shadows. Alice pushed past the final splintered trunk of a massive pine tree and stopped, her breath catching in her throat. Mal stepped up beside her, his hand resting on the hilt of his broadsword. They had reached the foot of the Black Mountains. The scale of the peaks was staggering. They didn't slope gently upward from the dead forest. They sheared straight out of the ash-choked earth like colossal, jagged obsidian blades, stabbing aggressively into the bruised purple twilight. Alice tilted her head back, her eyes tracing the treacherous shadowed ridges high above. She searched the oppressive gloom for any sign of a stronghold, a sprawling fortress of stone, a lone watchtower, or even the faint flickering orange glow of a sentry's fire. There was nothing. The mountains were as dead and silent as the forest behind them. "I don't see anything," Alice whispered, her voice barely carrying over the low, constant hum of dissonance that vibrated in the air. "Keep looking," Mal murmured, his voice tight with tension. He didn't pull out the brass-rimmed spyglass. The fading light would make the lenses useless, and the flash of glass could give away their position. Instead, he pointed slightly to their right, toward the edge of the tree line. The cracked, ancient paving stones they had been following finally emerged from the grey mist of the dead forest. Here, at the base of the colossal peaks, the road widened significantly into a massive, shattered intersection. 3 other roads met the one they had travelled. One wide, deeply rutted path veered sharply away, carving a wide arc around the outer edge of the burned woods. Another, narrower trail curved tightly along the rocky bottom of the mountain range, disappearing into the gathering shadows of the foothills. But the final road, the widest, best-preserved stretch of ancient stone, didn't go around the mountains. It went up. It was a staggering feat of engineering. The road was carved directly into the sheer face of the black rock, winding back and forth in a series of terrifying, unprotected switchbacks that disappeared into the heavy clouds clinging to the upper peaks. "That is the path of the dark magician," Poppet projected into Alice's mind, his sleek black form emerging silently from the ash beside her leather boots. His yellow eyes were locked on the winding road. The dissonance pours down that stone like water. Whatever Severin is building, it is high above us. Mango trotted up to join his brother, his ears flattening slightly against the cold wind whipping off the rock face. A very impressive staircase. However, it is entirely exposed. If that knight or his samurai friend decide to ride down while we are walking up, there is absolutely nowhere to hide on that sheer cliff. "Mango is right," Alice agreed softly, pulling her heavy green cloak tighter around her padded tunic. "We can't take the road. If they have patrols, we'll be sitting ducks." Mal rubbed his beard thoughtfully, his eyes scanning the treacherous terrain to the left of the switchbacks. The mountain face there wasn't a sheer cliff, but a chaotic, steep jumble of massive, jagged boulders that looked as though a giant had shattered the side of the peak with a hammer. It looked incredibly dangerous, completely unforgiving, and entirely hidden from the road. "We go off-road," Mal decided, adjusting the heavy leather backpack on his shoulders. He pointed toward the boulder field. "It will be a brutal climb, and it will take twice as long, but the rocks will provide cover from the wind, and more importantly, from anyone looking down from the road." An arduous climb through jagged rocks in the freezing dark, Mango projected with a heavy mental sigh, his tail drooping slightly. "How delightful! I shall add this to the growing list of reasons I despise Severin. Focus on your footing, brother," Poppet commanded gently, already picking his way delicately over the first scattered stones at the edge of the tree line. "The darkness here is not our friend. The shadows are thick with his corruption." With the sickly grey light of the day finally dying completely, Alice and Mal followed the 2 black cats into the boulder field. The ascent was agonizing. The rocks were slick with freezing mist, their edges sharp enough to slice through thick leather if they weren't careful. Every step required complete focus, testing the stability of the stone before committing their weight. Alice found herself using her hands as much as her feet, hauling herself up over boulders the size of small cottages, her muscles screaming in protest. They climbed in absolute silence for what felt like hours, the only sounds the scrape of their boots and their own ragged breathing. But as they hauled themselves over a particularly massive ridge of black stone, Alice paused, wiping the freezing sweat from her forehead. She looked down. The dead forest was far below them now, a sea of swirling grey mist completely swallowed by the night. But when she looked to her right, toward the winding road they were avoiding, her blood ran cold. Alice hissed, grabbing his wool-lined arm and pulling him down behind the jagged lip of the boulder. "Look!" Mal dropped instantly, pressing his chest against the freezing stone. He peered over the edge, his eyes widening in the gloom. Less than 50 yards away, moving down the switchbacks of the ancient mountain road, was a small army. It wasn't a disciplined marching column of soldiers. It was a vast, scattered, terrifyingly silent horde. There had to be at least 500 of them, spilling down the dark stone like a river of violence. The moonlight broke briefly through the bruised clouds, illuminating the chaotic array of their ranks. Alice saw men clad in heavy fur-lined pelts, carrying massive iron axes, walking shoulder to shoulder with warriors in intricate gleaming bronze breastplates, holding long curved scimitars. There were archers in boiled leather armour, swordsmen in rusted chainmail, and towering figures wielding weapons Alice couldn't even begin to identify. They were from a dozen different realms, pulled across the multiverse by Severin's dark magic, and every single one of them looked armed, lethal, and ready for slaughter. Down, Poppet projected sharply into their minds, his sleek black form flattening completely against the rock beside Alice. "Do not move! The dissonance radiating from them is suffocating. If they sense us, we are dead." Mango didn't even project a sarcastic remark. He simply pressed himself into the deepest shadow he could find, his golden eyes wide and unblinking. Alice held her breath, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She squeezed her eyes shut, pressing her face into the cold, damp stone of the boulder. The sound of 1,000 heavy boots crunching against the road echoed through the freezing night, accompanied by the clatter of weapons and the low, guttural murmur of languages she didn't understand. The horde seemed to take an eternity to pass. Alice's muscles cramped from the cold and the tension, but she didn't dare shift her weight. Only when the heavy rhythmic thudding finally began to fade into the grey mist of the dead forest below, did Mal slowly raise his head. He let out a long, shaky breath that plumed in the freezing air. "They're gone?" Alice slumped against the boulder, her entire body trembling. She looked at Mal, her eyes wide with terror. 500 of them, from everywhere. "Mal, how are we supposed to fight that?" "We don't," Mal said grimly, adjusting the heavy broadsword strapped to his back. "We didn't come here to fight an army, Alice. We came here to find the stolen magic and Severin. If that horde is marching down into the valley, it means they aren't guarding whatever is at the top of this mountain." "The Scotsman's logic is sound," Mango projected, finally unflattening himself from the rock and giving his dark coat a nervous shake. "Though I must admit, my enthusiasm for this rescue mission has significantly waned in the last 10 minutes. "Keep climbing," Poppet ordered softly, his gaze fixed on the jagged peaks above them. The dark magician's stronghold awaits. With the terrifying reality of Severin's power fresh in their minds, they resumed their agonizing ascent. The boulder field grew steeper and more treacherous the higher they climbed. The air thinned, burning their exhausted lungs, and the freezing mist clung to their wool cloaks like a heavy wet blanket. Every handhold was a struggle, every step a test of endurance. Finally, hours later, the sheer vertical face of the mountain began to level out. "Almost there," Mal grunted, hauling himself over the lip of a massive flat ledge of black stone. He rolled onto his back, gasping for breath in the thin air. Alice was right behind him, her arms shaking with fatigue. She reached up, her fingers scrabbling for purchase on the slick rock, but she couldn't find a solid grip. "Allow us," Poppet projected smoothly. Before Alice could react, Poppet leapt from a nearby rock, his sharp claws finding purchase in the thick leather of Mal's heavy backpack. Using the exhausted archaeologist as a living ladder, the black cat scrambled up and over the ledge. Mango followed a second later, vaulting lightly off Mal's shoulder and landing perfectly on the plateau above. "Ow!" Mal muttered weakly from the ground. "Claws!" With the cat safely up, Mal reached down, grabbing Alice's arm and hauling her over the final steep incline. Alice collapsed onto the flat, freezing stone, her chest heaving as she stared up at the swirling, bruised clouds. They had done it. They had scaled the Black Mountain. She slowly pushed herself up onto her knees, wiping the sweat and mist from her eyes, and looked out across the jagged, windswept plateau. Night had fully claimed the realm, plunging the world into absolute darkness. But miles in the distance, cutting through the gloom like angry orange eyes, was a massive cluster of flickering torches. "Severin!" Alice breathed, staring at the distant, sinister glow. Mal sat up beside her, his weathered face tight with exhaustion as he stared at the torchlight. The stronghold was still a long, treacherous walk across the rugged plateau. "We can't go any further tonight," Mal said, his voice heavy. He looked around the desolate, rocky plain. "We're exhausted, and we'll stumble right into a patrol in the dark. There's a cluster of jagged rocks over there that should break the wind." He pointed to a dark shape a few 100 yards away. "We rest there until daylight. Then we see what the dark magician has built." They made it to the cluster of jagged rocks Mal had spotted, collapsing against the cold stone, just as the freezing wind began to howl across the exposed plateau. There was no fire tonight, lighting one would be a beacon to any sentries, so they huddled together beneath their heavy green cloaks, eating the last of the hard cheese and cold salted pork in exhausted, shivering silence. Alice fell into a fitful, dreamless sleep almost the moment she closed her eyes. When she woke, the world was still trapped in a bruised, sickly twilight. The sun had not yet breached the heavy, swirling clouds, but the biting cold had seeped deep into her bones. She sat up stiffly, her muscles screaming in protest from the brutal climb the day before. Mal was already awake, sitting cross-legged a few feet away, silently checking the edge of his broadsword in the gloom. Mango was curled into a tight black ball on the edge of Alice's cloak, his rhythmic purr the only warm sound on the desolate mountain. But Poppet was missing. Alice frowned, pushing the heavy wool off her shoulders. "Where's Poppet?" she whispered, her voice rough from the cold. "I am here," the cool, aristocratic voice projected into her mind. A moment later, a shadow detached itself from the jagged rocks above them. Poppet dropped silently down onto the stone floor, his sleek black coat ruffled by the freezing wind. His yellow eyes were bright and intensely focused in the dim early light. "I apologize for my absence," Poppet continued, pacing gracefully toward the small camp. "I did not wish to wake you. I have spent the last hour scouting ahead." Mal paused his sharpening, looking up at the black cat with a mixture of surprise and profound respect. "You went out there alone? In the dark?" "The gloom is my element, Scotsman," Poppet projected dryly, sitting tall beside his sleeping brother. "My eyesight is far keener than yours in this miserable twilight, and my movements in the shadows go entirely undetected. I needed to see what we were walking into before the sun exposed us." Alice leaned forward, her heart beginning to hammer a nervous rhythm against her ribs. She looked out toward the distant, rugged plateau, where the angry orange torches still flickered against the bruised sky. "What did you see, Poppet? Is it a fortress? How heavily is it guarded?" Poppet's tail wrapped tightly around his paws, his expression grim. "It is not a fortress in the traditional sense," he began, his mental voice dropping to a low, serious hum. I moved several miles ahead, scaling a high ridge that overlooks the center of the plateau. I expected to see high stone walls, massive iron gates, and towering battlements. He paused, his yellow eyes locking onto Alice's. I saw the exact inverse. Mal frowned, setting his broadsword down on the cold stone. The inverse? What do you mean? Severin has not built upward, Poppet explained, the image of the stronghold burning clearly into their minds as he spoke. He has dug downward. In the very centre of the mountain plateau, there is a massive circular depression, a crater so vast it defies natural explanation, and built directly into the sheer walls of that abyss is a colossal structure of dark, vitrified brick. Alice gasped softly, the terrifying visual taking shape in her mind. A castle sunk into the mountain itself. A massive stone staircase spirals down the inner wall of the crater, descending endlessly into the depths of the earth. Poppet continued, his mental tone laced with deep unease. The walls of the structure are riddled with thousands of windows, each one spilling that sickly flickering orange torchlight into the dark. It goes down further than even my eyes could pierce. It is a stronghold of shadows, Alice, a monument to dissonance. Mango stirred at the edge of the cloak, lifting his head sleepily. A reverse castle, he projected, blinking the sleep from his golden eyes. How terribly unoriginal for a dark magician. Does it at least have a heavily guarded kitchen near the top level? It is swarming with Severin's corrupted forces. Poppet ignored his brother, focusing entirely on Mal. The sheer scale of the structure is staggering. If the stolen magic of Bast is being held anywhere, it is deep within the bowels of that abyss. Mal rubbed his bearded face, letting out a long, heavy breath that plumed in the freezing air. He looked at Alice, his blue eyes hard and determined. "Well," Mal rasped, reaching for his heavy leather backpack, "we knew it wasn't going to be easy. If Severin is at the bottom of that pit, then that's where we go." They packed up their meagre camp in silence, the freezing wind whipping their heavy green cloaks around their legs as they stepped out from the shelter of the jagged rocks. The pale, sickly grey sun was just beginning to breach the horizon, casting long, warped shadows across the desolate plateau. "We must move carefully," Poppet projected, taking the lead as they began to pick their way across the broken stone. "The closer we get to the crater, the stronger the dissonance becomes. Keep to the shadows of the boulders." They walked for over an hour, the sheer scale of the Black Mountains isolating them completely from the ruined world below. The air here was incredibly thin, and Alice's lungs burned with every breath. As they neared the high ridge Poppet had scouted earlier, the distant angry orange glow of the torches began to reflect off the low-hanging clouds, painting the sky in colours of fire and ash. Suddenly, Poppet stopped dead, his ears swivelling sharply forward. He didn't project a word. He simply darted ahead, melting into the shadows of a massive outcropping of rock. A few tense minutes later, his sleek black form reappeared, his yellow eyes wide with a new discovery. "Halt!" Poppet commanded telepathically, his mental voice sharp and urgent. Mal instantly dropped into a crouch behind a boulder, pulling Alice down beside him. "What is it? A patrol?" "Yes, but not a functional one," Poppet replied, trotting back to sit neatly before them. In the dim light of my first scout, I missed a deep crevice in the rock face just ahead. The rising sun has illuminated it. There is a small group of Severin's warriors camped inside. Alice's heart hammered against her ribs, her hand dropping instinctively to the hilt of her slender sword. "Are they watching the ridge?" "They are currently watching the backs of their own eyelids," Poppet projected with a distinct note of feline disdain. "They are in a deep, wine-fueled sleep. The stench of stale alcohol and unwashed armour is quite potent. More importantly, They have removed most of their gear and helms to rest. Mango, who had been lagging slightly behind, suddenly perked up. Sleeping guards? Wine? This is practically an invitation, brother. Have they perhaps also left out a plate of roasted fowl? Poppet ignored him completely, locking his golden gaze on Mal. This could be our only chance to sneak into the mountain citadel undetected. If we march down that spiraling staircase in our current attire, we will be slaughtered before we reach the first level. But if we appear to belong to his horde... Mal's eyes lit up with sudden, dangerous realization. He looked at Alice, a tight, determined smile crossing his weathered face. Disguises. Poppet is right. We need to look like we belong in Severin's army. Alice swallowed hard, the terrifying reality of the plan settling into her stomach. You want to sneak into a camp of sleeping, bloodthirsty warriors and steal their clothes? I want to live long enough to find the magic of Bast, Mal corrected gently, checking the buckle on his broadsword. It's a massive risk, Alice, but walking into that inverted castle without a disguise is suicide. Alice took a deep, steadying breath, her fingers tightening around the rough wool of her cloak. Okay, lead the way. They left their heavy leather backpacks hidden behind the boulder, taking only their weapons. Moving with agonizing slowness, Mal and Alice crept toward the deep crevice Poppet had indicated. The two black cats flanked them, slipping through the shadows like living smoke, their golden eyes constantly scanning the surrounding plateau for any signs of an awake patrol. As they neared the opening of the crevice, the stench Poppet had mentioned hit Alice like a physical blow. Sour wine, sweat, and old blood. Mal peeked around the jagged rock. Inside the shallow cave, 5 massive warriors were sprawled across the hard stone, snoring loudly in a tangled heap of furs and discarded armour. Empty clay jugs lay scattered around the dying embers of a small fire. Alice's breath hitched. They were terrifying up close. One of them, a brute with a scarred greyish face that didn't look entirely human, was using a dented iron breastplate as a pillow. Mal signalled Alice to wait, his eyes scanning the chaotic pile of gear discarded near the entrance of the cave. There were heavy chainmail shirts, shining steel cuirasses, and massive spiked iron pauldrons. Mal shook his head slightly. The metal was too risky. One wrong move, one clink of steel against steel, and the entire group would wake up. He pointed carefully to a separate pile of gear resting slightly further away from the sleeping men. It was a jumble of dark, boiled leather armour, thick tunics reinforced with iron studs, heavy leather bracers, and deep, hooded cowls designed to obscure the face. It was far quieter, much lighter, and infinitely more practical for sneaking. Alice nodded, understanding instantly. With painful, breath-holding precision, Mal slipped into the crevice. He stepped silently over an empty wine jug, his eyes fixed on the sleeping grey-faced brute. He reached the pile of leather armour and carefully, smoothly lifted a studded tunic and a heavy cowl, handing them back to Alice. Alice took them with trembling hands, stepping back into the shadows of the rock face. Mal returned for a second set, his movements practised and steady. He grabbed a pair of thick leather bracers and another hooded tunic, his eyes never leaving the rising and falling chests of the sleeping warriors. Just as he turned to leave, one of the warriors grunted loudly, shifting his massive weight and throwing a heavy fur-clad arm across his face. Alice froze, her heart stopping completely. Mal went perfectly rigid, blending into the shadows of the cave wall, his hand hovering inches from the hilt of his broadsword. "Do not move!" Poppet projected sharply into their minds, his yellow eyes wide and unblinking from his vantage point on the rocks above. An agonizing minute passed. The warrior let out a long, wet snore, settling back into his wine-soaked sleep. Mal let out a silent breath, slipping the rest of the way out of the crevice and pressing his back against the cold stone next to Alice. He held up the stolen leather armor, a triumphant, adrenaline-fueled grin on his face. They didn't waste a second. With their terrifying new disguises clutched tightly to their chests, they crept away from the sleeping camp, melting back into the shadows of the desolate plateau as quietly as they had arrived. They didn't stop moving until they had put a solid mile of jagged broken rock between themselves and the sleeping warriors. When Mal finally deemed it safe, they ducked into a deep, narrow fissure that shielded them entirely from the biting wind and any wandering eyes on the plateau. Alice dropped the stolen leather armor onto the freezing stone with a heavy, shaky breath, her adrenaline finally beginning to crash. Mal knelt beside her, his expression tight and focused as he quickly began to sort through the gear. "Put these on over your padded tunic," Mal instructed quietly, tossing Alice a heavy dark brown leather cuirass reinforced with dull iron studs. "It's going to be bulky, but that works in our favour. The less you look like yourself, the better." Alice didn't argue. She pulled the stiff, foul-smelling leather over her head, buckling the thick straps tightly against her sides. The armour was heavy, designed for a warrior twice her size, but Mal was right. It completely obscured her shape. She pulled on the thick leather braces, securing them over her forearms, and finally pulled the deep, shadowy cowl up over her hair. Mal was already dressed in his own set of stolen armour, the dark leather blending perfectly with his weathered, bearded face. He pulled a length of rough, grey, scarf-like material from the pile and wrapped it tightly around his neck and lower face, leaving only his piercing blue eyes visible in the gloom. He tossed a similar piece of fabric to Alice. She wrapped it around her nose and mouth, pulling the heavy hood low over her forehead. When she looked up, Mal was staring at her, nodding approvingly. She looked exactly like one of the nameless, faceless mercenaries marching down the mountain road. "A remarkable transformation," Poppet projected smoothly, stepping delicately out from behind a boulder to inspect them. "You look thoroughly unpleasant and deeply threatening. It is a vast improvement." "I, however, have a distinct lack of heavy leather," Mango chimed in, trotting up beside his brother. He looked pointedly at the discarded scraps of armour. "I do not believe Severin's forces typically include a pair of majestic, glowing black cats. Unless, of course, they intend to worship us, as Bast did, in which case I am ready to lead the charge." Mal sighed, his blue eyes crinkling slightly above his scarf. "No worshipping today, Mango. If Severin stole the magic of Bast, his army knows exactly what you two look like. You can't be seen." He turned to the 2 leather backpacks they had left hidden in the fissure. "We have to make room." Alice knelt quickly, unbuckling the flap of her pack. She pulled out the spare woolen socks, a heavy blanket, and half of the remaining salted pork, piling them reluctantly against the cave wall. Mal did the same with his, sacrificing a bundle of dry kindling and the rest of the hard cheese to hollow out the main compartments. "In you go," Mal muttered, holding his pack open. Poppet didn't hesitate. He stepped gracefully into the leather bag, curling his sleek body tightly into the bottom until he was entirely hidden beneath the flap. Mango stared at Alice's open backpack with a look of profound, golden-eyed betrayal. "You expect me to travel in a sack, like a common tuber?" "Get in the bag, brother," Poppet commanded sharply from inside Mal's pack. "Unless you prefer to test your claws against the broadswords of 1,000 corrupted mercenaries." With a dramatic, offended huff, Mango stepped into Alice's backpack. He circled twice, settling grumpily against the remaining waterskins. Alice gently buckled the flap, leaving enough of a gap for air, and hoisted the surprisingly heavy pack onto her shoulders. "All right," Mal said, his voice muffled behind his scarf. He checked the broadsword at his back one last time. "Let's get to that high ridge. We need to see exactly how this inverted castle is laid out before we walk into it." They slipped out of the fissure, moving with renewed heavy purpose across the desolate plateau. The armour clacked softly with their steps, a new intimidating rhythm that Alice forced herself to match. But as they neared the high, jagged outcropping Poppet had scouted earlier that morning, Mal suddenly threw out his arm, bringing them to a jarring halt. He didn't need to say a word. Alice saw it too. The pale, sickly grey sun had finally breached the heavy clouds, casting a weak, watery light across the plateau. And illuminated against the skyline of the high ridge, exactly where they had planned to scout the crater, were dozens of silhouettes. They were heavily armed figures, patrolling the exact spot Poppet had stood only hours before. Alice's heart sank. She felt Mango shift nervously inside her backpack, his weight pressing against her spine. "They have secured the perimeter," Poppet projected, his mental voice tight with frustration. "My apologies, Mal. They were not there during my initial sweep." "It's not your fault," Mal whispered, his blue eyes narrowing as he watched the distant sentries pacing the ridge. "The sun is up. The stronghold is waking." He ducked low, pulling Alice back behind the cover of a massive shattered boulder. The path to the ridge was completely cut off. They had been incredibly lucky to have Poppet scout ahead in the dim light, but now getting a tactical view of the inverted castle would be impossible without a fight they couldn't win. Alice looked at Mal, her breathing shallow behind the rough fabric of her mask. "What do? We don't even know where the entrance is." Mal stared at the ground for a long, silent moment, the wind howling around the dark leather of his cowl. When he finally looked up, his eyes were hard as flint. "We take our chances," Mal said grimly. "We look like them now. We walk straight toward the crater, find the main road in, and we march right down the stairs with the rest of the horde.